Picture this. It's 1943, German-occupied France. A Gestapo officer is staring at a file that's been growing for 2 years. Intercepted messages, blurry photographs, witness accounts, a name that keeps appearing and then vanishing. Somewhere in the south of France, a woman is running circles around the most feared secret police force in history. She's smuggled hundreds of Allied soldiers out of the country. She's been arrested twice and talked her way out both times. She's jumped from a moving train. She's bribed, charmed, and outrun her way through dozens of checkpoints. The Gestapo have a name for her, the White Mouse. And they can't catch her. This is the story of Nancy Wake, journalist, resistance courier, guerrilla commander, and the most decorated Allied servicewoman of the entire Second World War. The Germans put a 5-million-franc bounty on her head. Her own comrades said she fought like 5 men. This is one of the great untold stories of the war. Let's get into it. Nancy Wake was born in New Zealand in 1912, grew up in Australia, and by her mid-20s was working as a foreign correspondent across Europe for the Hearst newspaper chain. She was in Germany when Hitler came to power. She was in Austria in 1934 when she saw Nazi brown shirts, street thugs beating Jewish men and women in the street, chaining them to lampposts while crowds watched and did nothing. She wasn't political. She wasn't an activist, but that day she made a decision. "I made up my mind," she said later, "that if I ever got the chance, I would do everything I could to bring down these evil men." She kept covering Europe through the late 1930s. In Marseille in 1937, she met Henri Fiocca, a wealthy French industrialist. They married in November 1939, 2 months after Britain and France declared war on Germany. By 1940, she was 30 years old, living comfortably in one of the most elegant cities in southern France, married to a rich man who adored her. She could have sat the whole thing out. She didn't. Here's the military situation Nancy walked into. France fell in June 1940, 6 weeks after the Germans crossed the border. Faster than almost anyone thought possible. The north of the country, including Paris, was under direct German occupation. The south became Vichy France, technically independent, run by a French government under Marshal Pétain, but in practice doing whatever the Germans told them. Marseille was in the south, so for a while life went on, but Nancy could see where it was heading. She started small, using her cover as the wife of a prominent local businessman. She helped people who needed papers, families trying to get out, Allied soldiers left behind after Dunkirk who were hiding in attics and basements with no way home. Then she connected with Captain Ian Garrow, a Scottish officer running a formal escape network. It was called the Pat O'Leary Line, and it funneled Allied personnel south through France, over the Pyrenees into neutral Spain, and then back to Britain. Nancy became one of its main couriers. This was not office work. She was physically moving people, what the network called the bodies, across hundreds of miles of German-patrolled territory, hiding them in safe houses, bribing guards and officials, talking her way through checkpoints with a cover story and a smile. And then, at the end of the run, leading groups on foot over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain. Think about what that means practically. The Pyrenees are serious mountains, the range that forms the border between France and Spain. In winter, at altitude, you're talking about brutal conditions. Nancy described the crossing routine matter-of-factly. 2 hours of hard hiking, 10-minute break, swap your wet socks for dry ones to prevent frostbite, keep moving. The German border patrols kept their dogs in the lower foothills. The terrain above was too rough, so you went high. Over roughly 2.5 years, Nancy Wake helped an estimated 2,000 people escape from France. 2,000. She was arrested twice during that period. Both times she talked her way out. Charming, plausible, the respectable wife of a Marseille businessman. What could she possibly know about anything? Both times the Germans let her go. But the Gestapo were watching. They tapped her phone. They intercepted her mail. They placed informants in her social circles. They started building a file on a dark-haired woman who kept showing up at the edge of their investigations and then vanishing. They gave her a code name, the white mouse, a pest they couldn't trap. Nancy found out about the nickname and was briefly amused. Then she realized just how much trouble she was in. The Gestapo had connected the white mouse to Madame Henri Fiocca. The jig was up. In late 1942, she ran. It was not a clean getaway. It took 6 separate attempts to get over the Pyrenees. She was imprisoned once in France and once in Spain. She jumped from a moving train. She went days without eating. She was shot at. But she made it. But Henri stayed behind. The network needed someone to cover her exit, to keep up the story that she'd just gone on a short trip. Nothing to worry about. She'd be back soon. Henri volunteered. He used his money and connections to protect the people she'd left behind in the network. The Gestapo picked him up shortly after Nancy crossed into Spain. They tortured him for months. They wanted to know about the network, about his wife, about where she'd gone. He gave them nothing. Henri Fiocca was executed in 1943. Nancy wouldn't find out until after the war was over. Nancy arrived in Britain in mid-1943. She'd lost her home, her husband was missing, and she'd just spent 2 years running an underground railroad through occupied France. She immediately signed up for more. She was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. If you're not familiar with it, Churchill created the SOE specifically to run sabotage and espionage operations inside occupied Europe. The idea was to build resistance networks, arm local fighters, gather intelligence, and generally make life as difficult as possible for the Germans from the inside. Churchill's orders to the SOE were famously simple: set Europe ablaze. The SOE put Nancy through their full training program. It was serious. Physical conditioning, weapons handling, demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, parachute jumps, codes and ciphers, undercover tradecraft. She was 31, not the typical age for commando school. She didn't care. Her instructors noted she was one of the better shots in her class. Her mission? Parachute back into central France, link up with the Maquis, the rural resistance fighters operating in the Avignon region, and help them prepare for the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. The Avignon is the dead center of France, rugged, hilly, remote. The Maquis there were a significant fighting force, thousands of men, but disorganized and undersupplied. Nancy's job was to fix that. On the night of April 29, 1944, 5 weeks before D-Day, she jumped out of a plane over occupied France. She landed in a tree. Her parachute caught in the branches and she was left dangling in the dark, in the middle of enemy territory. One of the Maquis men on the ground climbed up and cut her loose. He told her she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen fall from the sky. Her response to this is not suitable for a family channel. On the ground, she linked up with Henri Tardivas, one of the Maquis commanders and a man who would become her most trusted colleague in the field. He later described her like this: "She is the most feminine woman I know, until the fighting starts. Then she is like 5 men." Nancy was put in charge of finances and supply coordination for the Maquis, which sounds like a desk job, but absolutely was not. Every supply drop from Britain required a secure landing zone, a network of scouts, the right weather, the right moon phase, and working radio communications with London. She was managing all of that across dozens of separate resistance cells spread over a huge area of countryside. Any link in the chain breaks, and people die. She was also, from the start, going on operations herself. By spring 1944, the Germans knew an Allied invasion was imminent and were cracking down hard across France. In the Auvergne, that meant aggressive raids on Maquis positions. Nancy didn't stay at headquarters when the shooting started. The SOE's official records describe her conduct in combat as exceptional. In one firefight, a section of Maquis fighters lost their commander and started to break. Nancy took over, got them into position, directed the defensive fire, and pulled them back in good order when it was time to withdraw. 4 men in that section were killed. The rest made it out because she kept her head when they didn't. She led a direct assault on a Gestapo-held building. The goal was to destroy their communications equipment and free prisoners. She was involved in attacks on German supply convoys and infrastructure sabotage operations throughout the spring. There's one story from this period that people tend to go quiet when they hear. During a German raid on a Maquis camp, a woman was found who had infiltrated the group as a spy. She had to be dealt with immediately. There were no men available to hold her, and if she got word out, it would be over for everyone in the camp. Nancy killed her herself, hand to hand. She talked about it in interviews decades later with complete composure. She'd been trained to do it. There was no other option. She did it. That was all there was to say. Now the bicycle story. In the middle of a German offensive against the Maquis, their radio operator had to run and the code books were lost in the chaos. Without those codes, they couldn't communicate securely with London. Without London contact, the supply drops stopped. No drops meant no weapons, no money, and the whole operation would grind to a halt. Nancy needed new codes. The nearest SOE contact who had them was connected to a cell about 500 kilometers away. 500 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from Chicago to Detroit and back. Nancy got on a bicycle and rode there, and back. Through occupied France, through German checkpoints, on mountain roads, in the spring of 1944, with German security forces on high alert in the run-up to an Allied invasion nobody knew the date of yet. She did it in 72 hours. When she got back to camp, she could barely stand. Her comrades said it was the only time they ever saw her cry, and it wasn't from fear or grief, it was pure physical exhaustion. She handed over the codes, let someone else pour her a drink, and within a day was back at work. The supply drops resumed. The operation continued. Her men were stunned. She was annoyed they made a fuss. There had been a problem. She had solved the problem. Next question. That's who she was. June 6, 1944, the Allies land at Normandy. For the Maquis across France, this was the starting gun. They shifted from survival mode to offensive operations, cutting German communications, ambushing supply convoys, delaying troop movements toward Normandy, making it as hard as possible for the Wehrmacht to reinforce the coast. Nancy and her fighters were in the middle of all of it through the summer of 1944. Paris was liberated in August. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. When the war ended, Nancy found out about Henri, the man who had stayed behind so she could escape, who had spent months being tortured and had said nothing, had been dead for 2 years. She'd spent those 2 years fighting to get back to France, back to him. She didn't talk about it much. People who knew her said she carried that the rest of her life. She moved forward, the way she always did, by moving. After the war, the decorations came. The George Medal from Britain, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, America's highest civilian honor, the Légion d'honneur from France, 3 Croix de Guerre, the Médaille de Résistance, Medal of Resistance. By any measure, she was the most decorated Allied servicewoman of the war. She tried politics, ran for Australian Parliament twice in the late 1940s and early 1950s, lost both times. Worked for British intelligence in Paris and Prague during the early Cold War. Remarried in 1957, an RAF officer named John Forward. Late in life, she sold her medals to pay her bills. Completely unbothered about it. I'll probably go to hell, she said, and they'd melt anyway. She spent her last years at a London hotel that had been an officers' club during the war. She'd had her first gin and tonic there in 1940, introduced by the manager who had himself worked for the French resistance. Every morning she was in the bar, glass in hand, telling war stories to anyone who'd sit down. She died in August 2011. She was 98 years old. Her ashes were scattered over the hills of the Auvergne, the region in central France where she'd commanded 7,000 men, ridden 500 kilometers in 3 days, and kept an entire resistance network running by pure force of will. When a TV movie was made about her life in the 1980s, she despised it. They turned her life into a romantic lead, cooking, falling in love, wringing her hands while the men did the interesting parts. She had no patience for it. Did the Allies parachute me into France to fry eggs and bacon for the men, she said. There wasn't an egg to be had for love nor money, and even if there had been, why would I be frying it when I had men to do that sort of thing? 98 years old, still the sharpest person in the room. Here's what I keep coming back to with Nancy Wake. She wasn't driven by ideology or politics or a desire for recognition. She saw something in Vienna in 1934 that made her angry, and she never got over being angry about it. Everything she did flowed from that. The couriering, the mountain crossings, the combat command, the 72-hour bicycle ride. She didn't do any of it because someone told her to. She did it because she had decided it needed doing, and she was the one standing there. The Gestapo put a 5-million-franc bounty on her head. They never collected. She outlived most of them by decades. The white mouse, the woman they couldn't catch. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with your friends. I'll see you in the next one.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?